Hello and welcome back to our VR Beginner series, where we're going to be talking about scale and why it's important, as well as importing a mesh into our project and getting it set up as an interactable object. And if you're following along, your project should look something like this. And before we get into actually importing assets into our project, we need to talk a little bit about how Unity uses units and how can we leverage that to create objects that are realistic and believable to the player. Now, with every game, scaling is very important. You want to create objects that look correct in relation to one another. Like, you don't want to have a gun that is significantly larger than the player, or familiar objects like garbage cans or cars that don't necessarily look like they're in relation to the player. If the car is a little bit too big or too small, it's going to kind of throw off and ruin the immersion of your world. And that's even more important in virtual reality, since we're going to be grabbing actual objects with our hands. That sort of continuity error is going to be much clearer and much more apparent and much more immersion breaking. So how can we take some steps to hopefully be able to create projects or scenes where everything has a little bit better relationship between one another? And to start off, the first thing we need to establish is our unit of measurement. And that's going to be that one unit in Unity is a meter. And we can actually show this by, if we come into our hierarchy here and we right click, we'll create a 3D object and we'll create a cube. We'll reset its position in our scene, and then let's double click it to zoom in on it. And obviously, since the pivot point's in the center, it's going to be halfway through our little ground plane here. So let's raise it up in 0.5. And because of that, we'll notice that it is completely flush with our ground. And technically we can treat these units as generic units, but I very much like to stick with one unit is a meter. And one way we could do this in a much more long-winded way is if we created a cube that was a meter in the length, width, and height in a program like 3ds Max or Maya and imported it, it will be the same size as this cube here. And let's just use this as our little table. Let's create a material so we can see it a little bit easier. So let's create a folder, call it materials. And then we'll just create a simple material, and you can make it any color you want. I'm just going to make it my normal pink color, and I just have a little swatch here that I can use. So let's grab that, and then let's just apply it to our little table that we have going on. Now if we select our grabbable, it's sitting inside our table, and if we hold Control and we grab this green axis here in the up direction, we'll drag it and it'll snap right above our table here. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now if you remember when we set up this grabbable object, we kind of created it to a size that was easy for us to handle. And the goal with importing the mesh we're going to be using for our weapon, we'll get it to approximately this size. We're not going to get so in depth that we look up the size of the weapon online in terms of its barrel length and finding out its length in centimeters and then converting it and doing all that stuff. We very much could, but maybe a little bit too much for this particular tutorial. And you may kind of be thinking, Andrew, well, that's a little bit overkill, isn't it? Well, it depends how you look at it. If we take that same sort of rationale and we apply it to the environment itself, maybe it does change a little bit. And as an example, when I'm creating a scene, specifically an interior scene, I'll actually go and I'll look up what's the size of a door frame, what's the normal ceiling height, so I can create a sort of recognizable but a believable space that the user can feel at home in. If you're just kind of eyeballing it, you may make things that are comfortable for you, but if you have players that are very tall or very short, that world may not replicate the sort of relationship they're normally used to having. So if you're a tall person and you create a table that's easy for you to grab, if you don't look up maybe the actual normal height of a table and someone else plays your game, it may not work for them, or it may be difficult for them to grab something off of a table. So that's when those very particular measurements can come into play and can actually affect how people play your project. And if we want to, we can even use the grid in Unity to help us establish some of our snapping values and things like that when it comes to keeping objects on a plane and making sure they're all snug together. But this isn't a level design tutorial, so we're not going to do that too much. Now that we got that all out of the way, let's go online and find a model that we can use for our weapon. Alright, and for my project, I'm going to use a weapon by Quaternius. He has a bunch of great, wonderful free assets that you can use. But if you have your own asset that you already have downloaded, you can use that too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down here, and I'm going to use something from this Ultimate Gun Pack. Where in my original project, I believe I used one of these pistols here, but I think I'm going to change it up a little bit, and we'll use one of these revolvers here. And I think this will be revolver 1. So before we actually go and get that asset, we'll have these 3 folders here, where even if you're not getting your object from the same website I am, it may be important to know the differences between these things, where an OBJ is a very simple 3D file that has not only the mesh data, but in some cases materials as well, while an FBX is a much more advanced one where it can contain lighting and cameras, blend shapes, as well as rigging and animations. And I typically deal with FBXs even when I'm dealing with static objects that don't have any sort of extra animation or anything on them. And since these files are built in Blender, we're also supplied with the original blend files for the source. Alright, so I'm actually going to download an FBX here. So let's see, let's scroll down. We're going to get a revolver like I said. So we're going to download revolver 1 here. And we'll just download that. Alright, so now that we're back in Unity, and before we actually import our object, let's create a little home for it. So let's create a folder, and we'll just call this models, and we'll click and we'll drag our file we downloaded from our downloads folder into our models folder. And there we go. Now let's click on the revolver so we can look at it a bit more closely. And you'll see that we have these 3 sort of sections here. We have our model, we have a rig, animation, materials. We don't necessarily need to mess with all of these, but I will be changing some things in there because I'm a little weird, I'll be honest with you. And we'll be coming back to the model section because this is primarily where we're going to be working and changing things. But let's first go to the rig here, and you'll see that it technically has an import setting for generic. This is a static model that doesn't have any rigging on it, so usually I like to set this to none. And I'll do the same for the animation, where I'll just say we're not importing any animation. And then for the materials, if we're going to be changing these in the future, we can actually extract them from the file to put it into our project so we can edit them, but we'll keep it like it is for right now. If we want to customize things, maybe we'll do it in a future video. But if we want to see what materials it's actually using, we can see them here, which they're actually just very simple standard shaders with a simple color on them. We can also see them here if we expand the model right here in this little children. Alright, so let's collapse that, and we'll leave all this like it is. But the big thing we're going to be looking at, which is why I went over that entire primer of sizing and scaling and why it's important, is because not all the objects that you're going to be getting online are the scale that you need them or want them to be. So let's take this and let's drag it out into our scene. And so we can see it a little bit easier, let's disable our cube and our ground here. And you'll notice it's a little bit too big. If you remember, this is our grabbable object, which is going to be a scaled object of 0.2, meaning it's 20 centimeters. Then this revolver here is probably about 1 meter long. Let's expand our enable our cube again. It's actually probably maybe 2 meters long. So it's a little bit bigger than what we need it to be. So how can we combat this? How can we fix this? There are a lot of different ways that we can do this. And there are also a lot of different things at play here. There's the original units of the file being used, how they're being converted once they enter Unity, as well as the scale of the object itself. And we'll see here that it's 100 all the way across here. And this may happen if before the object is exported, if this scale isn't zeroed out, as well as the rotation, because you can see it was imported at a -90 rotation. And this can be a bit screwy sometimes. I usually like when I import a model to be the rotation to be zeroed out and the scale to be 1. So let's just update some of the values here. Now the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set the scale to 1. And I specifically do this because I want the default scale of all the objects in my scenes to be 1. Just in case if I'm instantiating an object or if I'm animating the scale in some way, I know that its original scale is 1. This can be problematic if you are instantiating different objects of different scales, and you have to write specific code to handle scaling of particular prefabs. Generally, you just want to be able to treat everything more or less the same, right? So let's set the scale of this. And obviously now, it is incredibly small. So let's double click there. And now it's absolutely minuscule. Okay, but how do we keep it at a scale of 1, but also make it a usable size? We can come in here. We're going to leave our units converted to what it is now, which is 1 centimeter in our file, 2.01 meters in Unity. So that's actually good. That's fine. But what we need to do is we can use the scale factor here to scale up the import size so we can get something that's a little bit more realistic. And I think I'm just going to guess 25 here since I'm using a different model. So let's hit apply. And let's double click it so we can get it back in our view again. Let's zoom out. And that's already looking pretty good. I'm going to hold Control and drag this up to that original interactable object we had. And I think that looks okay. I don't know if it's perfect. If we want to, we can tweak it more in the future, but it's a little bit easier for us to use without having to mess with the scale in the scene. Alright, so now let's actually make this into an interactable object. And I'm first going to start by going to this model and just renaming it to Revolver, because naming things is a pet peeve of mine, and I like to make sure that things are named so they're easier for me to find. It's kind of agonizing when you go into a project and there's files that you've like downloaded off of Google Images and they're just strings of numbers. It drives me crazy. So I try and keep everything consistently named. Alright, so let's go to our Revolver here. And when we import models into our project, you'll see that we have this little box here. It's not necessarily a prefab, because if we look at our prefabs, it's the blue cube, but when we try to make a prefab out of this, it's going to give us a little prompt here where it's going to say, do you want to make an original prefab or a prefab variant? And we're just going to make an original prefab here. Where I already had a prefab from a failed recording from previously, so let's make sure that we're using the one we just created. So I'm going to delete this, I'll delete this, and I'll rename this to Revolver. There we go. Now let's drag that one out into our scene to make sure that it's all looking good. Now let's get this set up. And like I showed you previously, we can sort of do this within its own little prefab mode, but I'm going to keep it in context and I'm just going to work with it in the scene here. Now let's re-enable these two objects here. And so we can raise up our Revolver a little bit more. Alright, and with a simple project like this, we can have fairly simplistic collision for it. I usually don't use mesh colliders because they're pretty taxing and generally you can get away with not using them. So we can come over to our add component and let's add a box collider. And you'll notice that when we added this box collider, it's going to do its best to encapsulate the entire mesh in it. And this is because when you add a collider that has a mesh filter on it, it's going to use that information to center it and size it appropriately. And this is the collider that we're going to be using for actually picking up our weapon itself. So we have that, and then let's add our XR Grabbable component. There we go. Where at this point we should be able to pick up this object, right? But let's create a script so we can actually write some code for our weapon. So let's collapse these two folders and we'll create a new script that we're going to call weapon. Let's select our Revolver, and then let's drag our weapon script onto this. Then we'll collapse our grab here. Alright, and now that we have that, let's apply all of the changes we just made. So we'll say apply all. And one thing you'll notice is that we have both the grab interactable script as well as our weapon script. And there are a lot of different ways that we can hook these two things up together. Kind of how we did previously for our grabbable object. We use these interactable events that we hooked up in the inspector, but for our Revolver, we're going to be using a different method for taking functionality from this weapon script and programmatically attaching it to the events themselves. And we're going to do that now. And specifically, we'll just have a really simple print statement when we pick up our Revolver and we pull the trigger. I think that's easy enough. So, without further ado, let's open up our weapon script. Alright, and now that we're in our weapon script, what we're going to be doing is getting that grab interactable and attaching some functionality to that onActivate event. And to access the class that is the XR Grabbable, it's going to be in a namespace, and we're going to need that namespace up here at the top of our script to access it. And that's going to be an incredibly long namespace called Unity Engine XR Interaction Toolkit. Now we're also not going to need any of this functionality as of right now, so we'll get rid of that. And let's make a variable to store our interactable. And we'll make it private. And we'll call it XR Grab Interactable. And we'll just call it interactable. And I specifically use awake for getting components, or usually setting up functionality on the object itself. And then for start, I will maybe use that for some actual visual functionality that happens in the scene. But let's get our interactable. So we'll say interactable equals get component XR grab interactable. And if you remember, I specifically pointed out that both the weapon and the XR grab interactable are on the same game object. So that just lets us use get component. We don't need to do anything fancy, where if it was childed or parented, we could use get component in parent or in child, but we don't need to do that, but it's a good thing to be aware of. Next, we're going to create our very simple firing functionality. Well, we'll create the signature for it. We're not going to actually write it, but we'll create a function that we're just going to call fire, and it's going to accept an argument of type base interactor. And we won't talk about this too much in this video. We will once we start to write out more of this functionality. So it needs to be of type XR base interactor, and we're going to call it interactor for the actual thing that we're passing in. But when we actually call this fire functionality, let's just print something out. And we'll just say fire. There we go. But as of right now, this is just a function. We're not actually calling it. So like I said, how do we programmatically hook up this function to those events in that XR Grab interactable? And there's a couple different ways that we can do it, but we'll be connecting this functionality to the Grab interactable in the onEnable and onDisable functions that we get from being a mono behavior. So say private void onEnable. Whenever the script is enabled, it's going to make sure that it's going to hook itself up to the interactable, and when it's disabled, it's going to unhook itself. And to reiterate, this is sort of that process that we did in the last video where we clicked an object within our hierarchy and then we dragged it over to one of the public events in the inspector, where instead of the select enter and exit, we're going to be using onActivate. So we'll use our reference that we have to that interactable object. We can say onActivate, which like I said is going to be an event, and we can say add listener. What the script is going to do, it's going to listen for whenever the interactable object is activated. And we'll just need to write fire. And there we go. That's all we need to do for that. So anytime that interactable object is going to be activated, so once it's been picked up and the trigger is pulled, we're going to be running this fire functionality. Now what we can do here is I'm going to hit Control-D to duplicate it, and I'll move it down to onDisable. And then instead of add listener, we're going to remove it. And there we go. All right, so this all looks good. Let's go back in Unity so we can test it. And to kind of reiterate what we just did, is that if we look at the XR Grab interactable, we're going to be getting this component up here via the weapon script and going to that onActivate event to programmatically set up this event. But since we don't need to do that, let's just remove that. And then I think our gun may take a tumble off our little table here. So let's just move these a little bit so they'll be close to where they are when we hit play. All right, that's close enough. Let's hit play. Now, actually, before we do that, I don't think the revolver is going to, I don't know if it's going to align itself correctly. So if it doesn't, we'll tackle that in the next video when we talk about the attach points as well as setting up a childed game object for our barrel and all that good stuff. So let's hit play. All right, and it happened about what I expected. Our gun isn't exactly the correct size just yet, and it's not oriented correctly. But when we pull the trigger, we're actually going to be getting those print statements in our console. So that's actually working for us. Now that we have an incredibly rough weapon setup, we can continue this in the next video for delving a little bit further into some of the customization options that we have. But that about does it for me in this video. I'll see you on the next one.